Well, hello everybody. In today's video, I will be converting a MTH Yellowstone from Proto Sound 3 over to a Soundtraxx Blunami decoder, along with a current keeper. Stay tuned. The first thing we have to do is remove the shell. That is done with a screw under the sand dome cap and a screw underneath this cap here. Both are magnetic. You just remove the cap, take the screw out, and lift the shell off. As you're lifting the shell off, be careful with the cab light wire so you don't rip it out of the shell. Once you uncouple that, you can remove the shell and set it off to the side. So the next step we're going to do now that we have the shell off is remove the factory motherboard, smoke unit, and the boiler board. The smoke unit is being removed as Soundtraxx decoders are not capable of operating a smoke unit yet. Once Soundtraxx creates a decoder that can operate a smoke unit with the synchronized puffing, these can be left in the future. But for now, we will remove it to save some space. As you saw earlier, I also desoldered the wires from the smoke unit, and I use a soldering iron set at about 700 degrees as it allows the solder to quickly melt without hurting the board or the wires. So what I'm doing here is I am desoldering the wires that ran to the smoke unit and discarding them from the motherboard. I am also desoldering the wires that run to the front marker lights and the headlight, and then pulling those wires out of the way as we will use those in future steps. The next three wires that I'm going to desolder run to the board that controls the synchronized chuffing for the smoke unit with the Proto Sound 3 decoder. These will be removed as we do not need a flywheel to synchronize the chuffing with the wheel movement when we install the Soundtraxx decoder. That will be controlled via a CV setting later once the decoder is installed. The rest of the wires that I am desoldering here on the back of the board run various features such as the motor positive and negative, the track leads, and the backup light and rear marker lights. These will be desoldered and moved out of the way to be deciphered later when we connect the Soundtraxx decoder. So now that all the wires have been disconnected from the factory motherboard, we will take a screwdriver and remove the two Phillips screws that still hold that board in place. Once those are removed, the factory motherboard comes out of the locomotive. Once we have that factory motherboard out of the way, we can get down to the boiler board and remove that as well. That is also held in by 2 Phillips screws. Once you have removed the screws for the boiler board, you will find that there is a quick plug with several wires in it. Those wires have already been disconnected from the motherboard and can stay with the quick plug. The only 2 wires that you will need to cut are the motor positive and negative leads. Make sure to cut them long enough for the wires to reach the motor. The other thing you need to save is the quick plug for the cab light. Cut that off and set it aside for later. Once you have done that, you can remove the bracket that held the boiler board, and that completes the disassembly of the ProtoSound 3 from the boiler and engine. So now we're going to start the reassembly of the boiler. The first step we're going to do is test the LEDs with a 9-volt battery with alligator clips. An important part here is to make sure that you have a 1000 ohm resistor soldered into it somewhere so you do not blow out the LEDs. Find your LED leads and connect the alligator clips to each side. Right here, the positive went to the orange wire and the negative went to the black wire. However, as I discovered later, MTH is backwards, and the positive is the black and the negative is the orange. The next thing I'm going to do is test the motor leads to figure out what is the positive and negative. To do this, I'm going to touch them to a 9-volt battery and see which way the engine goes. As I have found here, the yellow lead is the positive and the white is the negative. All I am doing here is removing the 3 wires that go to the flywheel for the synchronized chuffing. Now that I have discovered what they are for, they are no longer needed. So before we start soldering anything to the decoder, we need to tin the end of the wires. Tinning is the practice of soldering the end of an exposed wire to make it solid. To do this, I use flux, and it is very important to use a electrical grade flux that will not damage the motherboards or the electric components. The solder I use is one that Soundtraxx had recommended a while back. Tinning the wires will make it much easier to connect wires to each other when the time comes. So when I was planning out this conversion, I wanted to use the factory drawbar to make the connection between the tender and the locomotive for the decoder. But as I dug into it more, I found that it was not going to be feasible. So at this point, I decided to remove the wires from the drawbar, and the drawbar will be strictly used to take the load between the locomotive and the tender. For the connection for the decoder to the motor and the headlights, that will be made using a DBX 9000 wiring harness that Soundtraxx has available. So now we're going to start working on the female end of the DBX 9000 wiring harness. This end will be permanently attached to the locomotive itself. What I am doing here is adding flux to the PCB board so that the solder will go to the specific hole that I want it to. I am then taking a wire that I have already tinned and putting it in the hole and holding the soldering iron onto it for just a couple seconds at 700 degrees. That gives it enough time for the solder to fill into the hole and make a good solid connection. The way I have set this up is the headlight is going in hole 1, which is the white wire. The front marker lights will go to hole 2. The common wire for the LEDs will go to hole 3. The motor positive will go to hole 4. The motor negative will go to hole 5. The track left wire will go to hole 6. The track right will go to hole 7. And later in the install, I realized I forgot to put in the harness for the cab light, so that one went to hole 8. And then I also installed a firebox light that will go to hole 9. So now that I have added all the wires to the female end, I'm going to flip it over and remove any spare wire that is sticking through the bottom. The less that you have sticking out of the bottom, the better, because it decreases your chances of it touching something and creating a short. Try to keep it as flush as you can to the actual board. To attach the female end to the locomotive itself, I use double-sided 3M adhesive tape. That is a thicker foam style. That way, nothing metal could rub through and potentially touch the metal chassis to create a short. The wire was then ran through the opening that the old wires was run through to get into the boiler itself. So now we're going to start connecting the actual components to the wiring harness that we have created. This first one that I'm going to do is for the headlight. Now remember, I had said earlier that I had tested the LEDs and found that the orange was the positive and the black was the negative. That ended up not being the case, and I had to come back after the install and switch it around so the LEDs would work. With MTH, their LEDs are wired backwards from all other LEDs for some weird reason. So with this, the white would go to the black wire, and then the orange would go to the blue common wire. One thing that I should note is before you start making the connections, make sure that you have heat shrink tubing over the wire so that you can cover and protect the joints. You don't want to have any exposed joints once the install is complete, because that could lead to a short down the line. So here we are connecting the orange motor positive and gray motor negative wires to their respective wires on the motor itself. What I am doing here is I am connecting the track negative wires from the front and rear trucks to make one wire. Then I will connect the wiring harness to that joint as well. I will also do the same thing for the track positive on the other side. And of course, once the joints are made, give them a slight pull test to make sure that they are solid before shrinking the heat shrink tubing over the joint. I prefer to use a lighter as it is quick, but you also have to be careful doing this so you don't melt the insulation on the wire itself. So on a side note here, I have found that with MTH models, their soldering seems to fail as the model gets older, such as it did here on the front marker light. I'm not sure if it's the solder they used or the quality of the wire itself and it just corrodes over time, but if they get movement, they will sometimes break off from the actual solder and then you have to resolder it. Once everything is soldered and heat shrunk, it's time to tuck the wires away so they are not flopping around inside the boiler. This is where I realized I forgot to include the wiring harness for the cab light and decided to add a aftermarket LED for a firebox flicker. Once you have everything installed, go ahead and reconnect the cab light and then carefully test fit the shell onto the locomotive to make sure that you are not pinching any wires and nothing is rubbing or trapped in the running gears. If everything looks good, go ahead and place the shell on and screw it down. And just like that, the first part of the project is done with the locomotive and boiler. It is ready to be connected to the tender once that install is done. So to get access inside of the tender, there are 4 screws that have to be removed. Once you remove these 4 screws, you can carefully lift the bottom of the tender from the top of the tender. As you do that, there will be a wiring harness that is connected to the bottom of the tender that goes to the rear marker lights on the top of the tender. Disconnect that harness and you can remove the bottom completely. The decoder itself will be screwed to the top of the tender via 2 screws. When you remove those 2 screws, you can remove the actual decoder and the bracket from the top of the tender. The factory LED for the backup light is also on the decoder itself. Now on the bottom of the tender is where most of the wiring is once the factory decoder is removed. In order to get this bracket off from over the speakers, there are 2 screws that need to be removed. Once you remove those, you can lift away the entire bracket and most of the wiring. During the filming of this video, I was not sure what wires were what, but in hindsight, all of these wires can just be cut out. None of them need to be saved except for the black and brown wire that are coming out of the tender itself. Those are your track pickups. Leave a little bit of distance with those wires as you will be using them in the future when we install the decoder. On the decoder itself that was attached to the top of the tender, there is a purple and black plug that you will need to cut off and save, as that is needed to reconnect the rear marker lights. The other thing that can be permanently removed from the bottom of the tender is the proto scale coupler. Since we are switching over to Soundtraxx, this function will not be available to be used anymore. I will replace this coupler with a KD coupler. And again, since the factory drawbar will not be used, the wires can be removed from it in the tender as well. So in order to wire up the speakers in series, you would take the positive lead from the decoder and solder it directly to the positive lead of the first speaker. Then the negative lead from the first speaker would be soldered to the positive lead of the second speaker, which is currently being done right now. Then the negative lead of the second speaker would be connected to the negative lead of the decoder. That is how you wire up 2 speakers in series for a Soundtraxx decoder. And we will connect the speakers to the decoder at a later time. As mentioned before, the factory LED for the backup light is connected directly to the Proto Sound 3 decoder. Since that has been removed, I will be super gluing in a replacement LED for the backup light. Now moving on to the decoder itself, the first thing that I'm going to do is cut off a little bit of the shrink wrap on the side where the FX5 and FX6 wires run out of. On this side, there is a quick plug for the current keeper that needs to be exposed. Once you cut away that shrink wrap, you can plug in your current keeper without any soldering. I highly recommend using a current keeper on all installs as it helps with dirty tracks and switches. Now we're going to start on soldering the actual decoder into the locomotive. When you're soldering in LED lights, the BLU2200 does not have built-in resistors, so you have to use a 1000 ohm resistor to protect the lights. If you don't use this, you will burn out the LED as soon as you turn it on. These resistors are cheap and easy to find on eBay or any online hobby store or at your local hobby store. One thing to note is each FX function lead needs its own resistor if it is being soldered to an LED. You can solder the resistors to the common side as well, from my understanding, but I find it easier and more reassuring to put a resistor on each FX lead. That way I know that each light has its own 1000 ohm resistor. Another option is if you would rather use a 21 pin decoder, NICS decoder buddies are a great option. They have the resistors built into them and essentially replace any factory motherboard that you would have while giving you the ability to use the 21 pin decoder over the BLU2200. For this engine, I chose to go with the BLU2200 because I only needed the 6 functions instead of the 8. So at this step, I am soldering the decoder to the DBX 9000 male end of the wiring harness. As you can see where my left hand is right now, I have each hole labeled on the female side of what each pin does. Then I am lining that up with the male side for each wire and making the joint. If it is an FX function for LEDs, it is getting a 1000 ohm resistor. If it is a track lead or the motor, positive and negative, those are just being soldered directly together. Again, don't forget to use your heat shrink tubing as you need to protect the joints to avoid creating a possible short. So now that all the connections have been made between the DBX 9000 and the decoder itself, the only thing that is left to connect are the track negative and positive leads inside the tender. In order to connect these to the decoder, what I like to do is strip a little bit of the wire without cutting it and then tinning that bare wire. I will then connect each lead to their respective wire and then cover it in heat shrink tubing. So the next thing I'm going to do is remove the factory wiring from the speakers. MTH has their speakers wired in parallel, but since we are switching over to Soundtraxx, we are going to change the wiring so the speakers are wired up in series. These speakers that are factory installed are 2-watt 8-ohm speakers. So these speakers will sound very nice with a Soundtraxx decoder. So as I said before, these speakers are going to be wired in series. So what I will do here is I will take the positive lead from the decoder and solder it to the positive lead of the first speaker. Then I will take the negative lead of the decoder and solder that to the negative lead of the second speaker. So the last thing to do now is to install the decoder and keep alive into the tender itself. To do this, I like to use a double-sided sticky tape again and stick the decoder to the base of the tender floor. The current keeper will also go on top of the decoder itself. For the DBX 9000 wiring harness, I will run that through the opening where the old wires ran through. Once this is done, I will carefully close up the tender and re-secure it with the 4 screws. As you can see here, the proto coupler has been removed and replaced with a KD coupler. All right, so here we go. First ever fire up of the 227. Track is being powered by a WTIU on variable power. Bring it up to about 14 volts. Or 15. And it fires up. So the next stage, go to the Blunami app. Let's see if it reads it. And there it is. So let's connect. And let's begin. All right, attempt number 2. Got the LEDs wired the correct way, I believe. And that we do. We have a headlight. Marker lights work, our cab light works, and our firebox works. So let's get this set up. And just like that, the address is 227. Alright, so now we're going to work on the exhaust chuff. First off, this is a Yellowstone, so let's try heavy 3. About heavy 2. We're going to go with heavy 3 on this one. Next up is the engine exhaust control. So right now we're going to focus on the first set of drive gears, since this is articulated. And this should make 4 chuffs per revolution. So right now we have 1, 2. Not enough. So let's change this up to 90, as I've already played with it and figured out that was the magic number. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want it to start in the same spot as close as it can be after 4 chuffs. So every time I say 1, it's right here in the top left corner. And this again being a Yellowstone has dual cross compound air compressors. For our dynamo, we'll go with that one. As for the whistle, we'll select a Hancock 3 chime. We will enable the articulated exhaust, as this is a articulated steam engine. We will also do a medium wheel slip so they go in and out of sync with each other from time to time. As for the equalizer, this is where Soundtraxx really shines, when their sound meets the speakers. So you can hear that air compressor just got a little bit deeper. We'll enable the auto cylinder cocks. And that's all we'll do in the sound. Next setting, we'll go to the lights. We'll change everything over from incandescent to LED. Now FX6 is the firebox flicker. So we're going to set that to LED, and then we are also going to choose firebox flicker. Speed settings will change in here a little bit. We'll make the acceleration 30 to give it a little bit of a slow start. And we'll make it 15 for deceleration to make it a little bit of a slow stop. So now if we go back and we turn on marker lights, rear marker lights, cab light, and now you can see that we have a firebox flicker. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the CV settings and play with these a little bit. So for the firebox flicker, I always want that on when the engine is running, so I'm going to set that to a value of 31. Now the firebox flicker will always be on as long as there is track power. Also going to our regular CVs here. And we're going to head down to the reverb. Change that to a value of 4. That'll give everything a little bit more of an echo. And before we head out, we will read all the CVs and update the decoder. And all CVs are read just like that. And the last thing we're going to do with this decoder is set up dynamic digital exhaust. This allows the chuff rate of the locomotive to increase and decrease as the load rate of the locomotive increases and decreases. So if it's going up a hill, the chuff will get louder and more intense. If it's going down a hill, the chuff will lessen and become quieter. This is how you set it up on Blunami. And just like that, dynamic digital exhaust is set up. So there you have it. That is the conversion process to remove the Proto Sound 3 decoder system from an MTH locomotive and convert it over to a Soundtraxx decoder. If you are debating between a Tsunami 2 decoder or a Blunami decoder, I would highly recommend going with the Blunami decoder for the extra couple bucks. It is the exact same decoder as a Tsunami 2 with the added benefit of being able to use an iPad or Android to control the locomotive. It also removes the need for a programming track and using any kind of programming software. The Blunami decoder allows you to do all of its programming through the app while it is on the main line. It will not interfere with other engines that are on it. I know this may seem a little tedious and time-consuming, but if you have a MTH locomotive that no longer works due to the defective Proto Sound 3 system, this would be a great option. A little time and patience, and you could have an excellent running locomotive again back in your fleet. Lastly, I want to give a shout out to George and the crew at Soundtraxx for always being extremely helpful if I ever have questions on my installs. Whether calling them on the phone or watching their YouTube videos, that is how I have learned to do these installs. I also want to thank Aaron down at A&S Trains for being a great hobby shop to deal with when purchasing Soundtraxx products. They are in Southwest Florida if you are looking for anyone. And if you are ever in the central Minnesota area and find yourself in Cross Lake, stop on into the Northern Minnesota Railroad Heritage Association Museum to see this locomotive running in person. I would also like to mention that this video is not sponsored in any way, shape, or form, and that I was not paid to do this conversion. The museum purchased all necessary components to make the conversion happen. Thanks for watching and have a great day.